A few weeks ago, I took a look at the trailer for John Woo's new movie, Silent Night, and I'm gonna do something here I rarely do, even in real life. Admit I was wrong. Trust me, it hurts just to say that. Stick around and I'll tell you what I got wrong and tell you my thoughts on the movie. See you on the other side. So if you're here, I have to assume you've probably already watched the trailer for Silent Night, and maybe even watched my review of the trailer. If you watched my review, thanks for that, sincerely. If you're back and you haven't yet done so, please consider subscribing to the channel. It actually makes a difference here, so thanks in advance. First, a quick plot summary. Silent Night is a story of a young family whose world is turned upside down on Christmas morning after their young son is killed by a stray bullet during a drive-by shooting between rival gangs. In vintage John Woo fashion, we start off thick in the action as Brian, played by Joel Kinnaman, is running down the street, covered in blood wearing a Christmas sweater. Brian eventually engages one of the vehicles and a gang member with tattoos on his face shoots him in the back and the throat. Brian barely survives, but the injury to his throat has left him unable to speak. It's at this point you realize no one has spoken so far, and almost no one will for the entire movie. We'll come back to that in a bit. Once home, you see the Christmas decorations are still up, even though it's clearly been weeks since the son was killed and Brian's been hospitalized. Toys are still left as they were all over the living room, and the son's bedroom hasn't been touched. It's clear that both are finding it nearly impossible moving on, but Brian is almost paralyzed by his grief. On his first day home, after completely breaking down and guzzling vodka in the kitchen, he looks to his wife and with tears in his eyes, he mouths, "Help me." She begins to cry and her head falls in her hands, and he turns and slowly walks into the garage where he secludes himself until he comes up with a plan, which is to hunt down the men responsible for killing his son. Is this average guy even capable? Will his marriage survive his fall into despair and vengeance? Will the police stop him? Will he see his plan through, and will he live through it if he does? Like I said earlier, I was wrong.
No way.
Based on the trailer and the poster, I thought this was going to be a fun time at the movie, a shoot-'em-up type deal, sort of like John Wick. I mean, I can't really be fully to blame for that. It's how the thing was marketed for some odd reason, complete with Ode to Joy being played in the trailer, reminiscent of Die Hard. The thing is, this movie isn't that. At all.
Fuck it!
But wait, before you misunderstand, this movie is absolutely fantastic. It's a must-watch for sure. It's just you need to forget what you saw in the trailer and be ready for what you're gonna get. And what you're gonna get is a deeply heart-wrenching story about a father's bottomless grief after losing a child he was madly in love with. Look, I'm the father of 2 sons, and I remember looking at them the way he does in this movie when they were that age, and I could imagine his despair and his complete inability to move forward after losing him. It's also about the way a loss can tear a marriage apart as each partner grieves in their own way. And this is all done with the backdrop of this being largely an action movie and without any real dialogue. This will end up being the lure for the movie, I think, the lack of dialogue, and believe me, it's masterfully done. Obviously, it's a bit of a gimmick, and you could see this being an assignment in a film school somewhere. But in the hands of a director like John Woo, it not only works, but it helps propel an otherwise average story into something so much more. It would have been easy to simply have the protagonist Brian lose his voice after the shooting and be unable to speak. I mean, for most movies, that's what would have driven the plot, and you can imagine all the obvious scenes for that movie and how that had played out. Not here, though. His lack of voice never really comes up. It's not a plot device and never a hindrance. Woo uses Brian's inability to speak as a reason to have no one speak, which is pretty incredible to see. Woo spoke extensively about how difficult this was. He said, "Making a film without dialogue is more difficult. It's not an easy job to do. You have to think more than usual. You need to find new ways, new style, and a very unique language to tell the story. Unique visual language to tell the story. The sound, the vision, using the vision instead of the language. It's not easy work. It needs a lot of thought." Now, as a viewer, though, it made the movie flow in a way I've never really seen. Because of the lack of dialogue, there were no tedious scenes movies usually need to move from point A to point B. Take for instance when Brian decides to begin his mission to take on the gang. He channels his grief into a frenzy of training and building things in his garage at all hours of the night. Now in most movies, you'd have gotten that scene where the wife has had enough and decides to confront him, and the typical dialogue would follow. "What are you doing? This isn't going to bring him back. You're tearing us apart. He wouldn't want this." I mean, we've all seen scenes like this 1,000 times, right? Here, though, what we get is Brian working feverishly in his garage only to slowly pan out to his wife standing silently in the kitchen, watching him descend further and further into his grief and away from her, and we see a single tear roll down her face. We don't need the other scene. They've had it off screen. We all know they have. So the movie moves forward in 15 seconds rather than a 3-minute scene with every trope and bit of hack dialogue imaginable. This happens over and over thanks to the lack of dialogue, and at no point are you left feeling as though you're lost. This movie may very well be the best example of show don't tell in history. In addition to Woo's direction, this wouldn't work without actors who can pull it off. Honestly, I'm not a huge Joel Kinnaman fan. I mean, I don't hate the guy like I hate Andrew McCarthy. I've just never found him to be anything great or really a leading man. I went into this thinking he'd be the weak link, and for a bit, I kept imagining other actors in the role. Turns out he pulled it off, and I think the fact that he's not a leading man, in my opinion, is partly why. Not only did he need to emote his anger over the loss of his son, but his fear in the face of his mission, and also portray an average guy, because that's another important part of what makes this stand out. Brian isn't ex-military. He's not an assassin. He's not a superhero. He's just a guy that worked at the electric company. No, an actual electric company. When he decides to go after the gang, he's starting from ground zero. He's not in world-class shape. He isn't some stunt driver. He can't fight, and as for shooting...
Yeah? From what I hear, you couldn't hit water if you fell out of a fucking boat.
We see just what a firearms novice he is after unloading his magazine, and he turns awkwardly toward the instructor and nearly points his weapon at him, and the instructor quickly stops him and turns it away. It's clear the guy knows about as much about firearms as your typical Twitter gun control advocate. Kinnaman pulls this off, and I'm not sure a guy like Chris Hemsworth, for instance, could have, because you'd assume he was already able to do these things. Action ramps up in the final third, and it's 100% John Woo. Stunning visuals with great camera work, great practical effects and stunt work, and a few epic fight scenes. Even so, Kinnaman again sells us by looking like a novice most of the time. He's not Batman or the Punisher. He's ginned himself up to do this, but he's got limited reps, so to speak. So not only is he visibly afraid, but he nearly dies right at the beginning. My favorite action scene of the movie was Brian's eventual assault of the gang's hideout, which gave you flashbacks to John Wick's assault on the Red Circle Club and a bit of Netflix's Daredevil in that stairwell. If you came for the action, this is where you're going to find it. In the end, there's so much here to love about this movie. It's heartbreaking and sad, and yet Woo tells the story in such an unconventional way that it makes it all okay. Just keep in mind, despite the odd marketing in the movie, this is not a balls-to-the-wall action flick, and if you go in expecting that, you're going to be turned off by 20 minutes in. This is a drama with action in it, and it does both incredibly well. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then I bet this is going to be a favorite of yours. I can't recommend it enough. Until next time, thanks for watching.